Hey there, music lovers. Welcome to the channel, and thanks so much for dropping by. In this video, I want to talk about the band Asia and the impact that their first album had on the music scene. And it was kind of an unlikely impact, too, especially when you consider where these guys came from. We're talking about a supergroup that was born out of the ashes of prog rock from the 70s. The guys that make up Asia came from bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, King Crimson, and Yes. And each of these bands were very successful in their own right, but prog rock as a genre was dead by the end of the 70s. And to have a band like this pop up in the early 80s with any expectations of being a commercial success, it was almost laughable. And so I could only imagine what, like prog rock fans who were, fans in the 70s thought of what this was going to sound like, and I would love to hear from you down in the comments. Let me know what your expectations were. I mean, if I had heard in the early 80s, having been a prog rock fan in the 70s, that you were going to get an album from, the likes of Carl Palmer, the P and ELP, John Wetton of Crimson, and Jeff Downes from Yes, and Steve Howe from Yes, I would have thought for sure, wow, we're going to get some kind of progressive rock masterpiece here. But we didn't get anything like that at all. What we wound up with was an album that was very, very mainstream, a melodic rock album, which was definitely not expected. Now, I remember that I was a fan of Asia at this time, but I had no preconceived notions. I hadn't I had heard of bands like Yes and ELP, but I hadn't heard them. And so when I heard these songs on the radio, like Heat of the Moment was being played on Top 40 radio, the album rock station that I was listening to was playing like Soul Survivor and Time Again. And these songs to me were very fresh and exciting. I just remember thinking, wow, that guitar player is really, really good. And that guy can sing. And the drums were really solid. And so that's what I was pulling away from it. And it's really quite amazing when you think back as to what these guys accomplished. You had these guys who came from prog rock bands that had died out in the late 70s or by the late 70s. And they were trying to come up with something fresh and exciting and that would sell records in the early 80s. And, this was the first time that prog rock, anything prog rock related, was this successful. Because, like I said, they wound up coming out with something that was surprisingly mainstream. I mean, this album went to #1, and it stayed there for 9 weeks straight. That's a major accomplishment. None of the bands that these guys came from ever achieved that type of success. They had a top 5 hit with Heat of the Moment, went to #4. I don't know that any of their previous bands ever had a top 5 hit, especially here in the States. Only Time Will Tell went to #17. The album wound up selling over 6 million copies, and it was the biggest selling album of 1982. When was the last time that any of the bands that these guys came from, Yes, ELP, Crimson, did they ever sell an album so huge that it was the biggest selling album of that year? I do not think so. So they had a major, major accomplishment here. I mean, this was huge for prog rock. Now, I realize that they were not bringing Close to the Edge to the mainstream. They were not reviving the progressive rock genre. But they were the first prog rockers to have success at this kind of level. I'm not even going to say that they helped to pave the way for bands like Yes and Genesis and even Gabriel, who went on to have major success in the 80s. I think that they earned it in their own right. But certainly Asia were the first prog rockers to have major success. And one of the reasons was because of MTV. I mean, that whole channel was about a year old in 1982, and they were ramping up, adding more and more households. Asia was making videos. They were getting played heavily on that channel. So between hearing them on Top 40 radio, Album Rock radio, MTV, Asia was everywhere. And they were selling albums, selling singles, selling out concerts too. They were selling out shows. They were the shit in 1982. And in terms of looking at the songs themselves, I thought that that first album was very, very strong. I mean, when you listen to it, it's like you can hear throughout the whole album, no matter where you are, there's always something interesting kind of jumping at you. Somebody is punching through. You know, you're listening to it and it's like, wow, that's a really cool guitar part. Listen to that solo. Or that's a nice keyboard piece there. Or how about, wow, that guy can sing. Listen to that vocal. Listen to his, just the power of Wetton's voice. And of course, Palmer's drums, very, very solid throughout the whole album. So the album just had all these great things punching through. I thought that it was very well stitched and had a really good flow about it. I think the album kind of has this excitement about it. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's the best thing that each of these guys have ever done. With the exception of Jeff Downes, I do think that this is the best thing that he's ever done. His best songwriting, and I think that his playing on this album is probably better than anything. You know, of course, Wetton too, I have to say. I think that the first Asia album really shows you what kind of a great singer that Wetton is. I think that when he was in Crimson, he was singing in a whole different style. I think he was singing a lot of times someone else's lyrics, and he was singing a mouthful. And I think that on Asia, you could really hear him soar. And I do think that that first Asia album might be Wetton's best vocal performance. Of course, Palmer has done much better drumming on the ELP stuff. And of course, Steve Howe has turned in some awesome stuff with Yes, no question about it. But I do think that on the first Asia album, Steve Howe shines. His guitar playing is just amazing. One of the best things that he's ever done, I think. I mean, you go back and you listen to a song like Time Again. His playing is fierce. The solo is amazing. You know, One Step Closer has got a really good solo in it. And his playing is just really solid throughout. And I think that if you haven't listened to this album in quite a while, you should go back and take a listen and clue yourself into what Steve's doing. It's just really, really good stuff. And so, you know, Asia has had their fair share of critics, you know, not just from the music critics, but a lot of fans kind of slagged them off as being this pussy band. You may recall the movie The 40-Year-Old Virgin. There was this great scene in there where the Virgin guys finally got this woman coming over to see him, and his friends are there with him, and you're like, man, you can't have her coming over here. And he's like, why? He's like, because you got a framed album from Asia on your wall, you know, along with like $6 Million Man dolls and stuff like that. It was a really funny scene. And I think one of the reasons why Asia gets a lot of shit is what came after the first album, because things did not get better, unfortunately. The second album, Alpha, there was a lot of expectations for that to be another million seller. And I think what had happened was they took a look at the songwriting team for the first album who had the hits. That would have been Jeff Downes and John Wetton. And they took over the songwriting for the second album. Steve Howe was kind of marginalized. And the production was totally different, you know, as I had just talked about on the first album, where you could hear everybody kind of punching through with like, wow, that sounds good and that sounds good. None of that on the second album. It was very plush. You could barely hear the drums. Steve Howe's guitar was kind of buried. It just didn't have as much color as the first album. And, you know, you did have songs like Don't Cry, which, you know, could have been great songs, but to me, they kind of came across as kind of lifeless. I actually liked a acoustic version that they did for VH1 when they got back in the mid-2000s. You could hear the essence of that song. I'll try to put a link to that. Also, The Smile Has Left Your Eyes. That was a song from the second album. I thought that was actually the best thing on that album. It's a really cool ballad. It's got a lot of power to it. As it keeps on going, you can hear Wetton kind of building. And I thought that song was really, really cool. But that album as a whole was lifeless, and it did not have the same energy and excitement as the first album. And it didn't sell very, very well. And so by the time we got towards the end of that tour, there was a lot of tension, especially between Steve Howe and John Wetton. And it got to a point where when they got to play Asia, the continent, they were doing this MTV concert. And John Wetton wound up getting fired because tensions had gotten so high. And they wound up bringing in Greg Lake, who was a singer with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And he was also in Crimson too. And so they brought him in to do the Asia in Asia concert, which was actually released officially. And I'll put a link to that down below. And that was just, I remember when I first saw that concert, it was just kind of strange to see Greg Lake singing in place of Wetton. They both have similar vocals, both have very deep, powerful voices. But Greg Lake was just out of his league. These were not really songs that he felt comfortable singing. He had to drop the key on them, and it really came off as kind of strange. And so by the end of that tour, Lake was out. And so when it came time to do the third album, Wetton came back, but he wanted Howe gone. And so when they did the third album, Astra, Steve Howe was gone. And so it was back to the original lineup, plus this guy named Mandy Meyer, who was in a band called Crocus. And so he was doing Howe's parts. And he's just, the guy was awful. He's nowhere near Steve Howe. The only thing from that third album that I really care about is a song called Go, which was the first single. And I thought that song has more of the spirit of the first album, and I think it would have been really cool to have Howe on that song. But that album really, really tanked. And I don't think they even toured for that album either. So Asia just kept getting worse and worse. Eventually John Wetton left and Carl Palmer left, and all you had was Jeff Downes kind of holding the baby. He was like the leader of the band, and he would bring in these various people to sing and everything. He had this guy named John Payne who was the singer, and this kind of ties into what I was talking about in one of my other videos where I mentioned how I met Jeff Downes. I interviewed him, and he was playing in Hershey Park, kind of a Spinal Tap moment. And you can check out my story about that. I'll put a link up to that video. But basically, they were at a point where they were playing like amusement parks. I mean, it was laughable. And then eventually the original lineup got back together. I think it was around 2006 or so. And they actually got back and they did like 3 more albums with the original lineup with Steve Howe and Wetton and Palmer. And those albums, they were never as good as the very first album, as the debut, but it was, it was good to see them get back, especially Howe and Wetton, because, Wetton had some health issues. He had open heart surgery, so it was good to see them kind of get back and reconcile things. And what was really sad was I remember going to see Carl Palmer. He did a show in Winchester, Virginia in November of 2016. I went to go see him. And what's interesting about that show, too, is that it was a fan-funded show. Like some fans of Carl's decided that they wanted to bring him there. So they actually paid for him out of pocket for him to show up, because it was kind of an unlikely place. But it was very, very intimate. Got to meet Carl, which was really, really cool. And during the show, he mentioned that John Wetton was not very well, that he was pretty sick. And I remember there was a gasp in the audience. Because I know that Asia was gearing up to go on tour. And so it was kind of like, wow, I hope that John's going to be, fine, And so I remember the following month in December of 2016, Greg Lake winds up dying out of the blue. I had no idea that Greg Lake was even sick. And, Palmer didn't say anything about Greg. He probably couldn't say anything. I'm sure that he had to have known. He winds up passing away. And then 1 month later, the end of January 2017, John Wetton passes away. And so within a couple of months of seeing that Palmer show, we lose both Greg Lake and John Wetton. And, both of them, of course, I talked about in this video, their ties to Asia, their ties to Emerson, Lake and Palmer and King Crimson. And, it was just sad. It was like, this, of course, was coming on the heels of having lost Keith Emerson and Chris Squire not too long ago. And so, you know, prog rock definitely has taken some hits. And so, you know, it's a real shame, all these losses, which is why, you know, if any of these guys ever come close to your town, try to go check them out before they're gone forever. You know, I know that we bitch and moan about the set list and about who's in the band and who's not in the band, but if they mean that much to you, go see them. I know when I first heard about Wetton passing away, it was so sad. I really, really liked John Wetton. His vocals, his voice was so great. He had such a great presence. Great bass player, great songwriter. I loved his time in King Crimson. I thought that time that he was in the band along with Bruford was just the best. Those were the best years. He was in this other band that I didn't talk about called UK, which was a supergroup that was formed right before Asia. That was more of a prog rock supergroup, not a pop band in any way. I thought they had some good stuff too. A tremendous loss, along with Greg Lake too. I was really sad to learn about Greg. You know, just powerful singers, great songwriters. You know, I grew up with these guys. But anyway, I think that the first Asia album was one of John Wetton's greatest accomplishments. And so I hope that you can go back and check it out. Let me know what you think about that first album. You know, what did you think about Asia? You know, if you were alive and well in the 70s and a fan of prog rock, what did you think of this album when it came out? Was it a letdown? And what do you think about it now? All these years later. Put your comments down below. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you like it. Hit subscribe too, and I'll talk to you later.